"If you walk out that door, don't ever come back," my dad yelled when I chose to marry a poor man. Years passed. Then he collapsed in court, facing bankruptcy. I stood up from the judge's bench, removed my robe, and said, "You'll always have a home with me, Dad." The air in the Thompson household was thick with silence, the kind that presses against the walls like an unspoken verdict. Emily Thompson stood at the edge of her father's grand oak desk, her hands folded tightly in front of her, knuckles white. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her head, but now that the moment had arrived, every word felt fragile, every breath difficult. "I'm marrying him, Dad," she said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded like a gavel striking the bench. Richard Thompson, towering behind his desk with the cold authority of a man who had conquered courtrooms for over 3 decades, didn't flinch. He simply raised his eyes from the papers before him and stared at her with a mix of disbelief and disapproval. His office, lined with shelves of legal texts and awards, felt more like a courtroom than a place of parental counsel. "Daniel Carter?" he asked, not hiding the disdain in his voice. "The artist?" "He's more than that," Emily replied quickly. "He's kind. He listens, he believes in people even when they're at their worst. I love him." Richard stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket as he moved around the desk. "Emily, love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't build a future. And love certainly doesn't justify throwing away everything you've worked for." Emily held her ground. "He works hard, and I'm not throwing anything away. I'm building a life I believe in, with someone who sees me, not just my resume." Her father's voice hardened. "You're a Thompson. Do you have any idea what that name means in this city? In the courts? You were meant for greatness, not mediocrity." Emily took a breath, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on her. "Then maybe I don't want to be a Thompson the way you define it. Maybe greatness isn't power and reputation. Maybe it's integrity. Maybe it's choosing what's right for your heart." For a moment, Richard looked as though he might say something softer. His brow furrowed, his mouth twitched, but then the wall came back up. He walked to the door and opened it. "If you walk out with him," he said coldly, "you're no longer my daughter." The words hit her like ice water, but instead of breaking, she straightened. She looked at the man who had raised her with iron principles, who had paid for her education, who had never once told her he was proud, unless it was followed by a correction. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but I'm walking out anyway." She stepped through the door without waiting for a reply. Outside, Daniel was waiting. He rose as soon as he saw her, searching her face for answers. Emily gave a small nod, and he took her hand. They descended the marble steps of her childhood home in silence. The large house behind them stood as still as a statue, cold and immovable. Once outside the iron gate, Emily paused for a moment and looked back, not for her father, but for the life she was leaving behind. That night, their new life began in a studio apartment above a bookstore in Cambridge. The ceiling leaked when it rained, and the heating groaned like an old man in winter, but it was theirs. They unpacked boxes filled with books, brushes, and dreams. The mattress was on the floor and dinner was canned soup, but they laughed. They lit candles, played old records, and curled up together beneath a single blanket. And though she cried once in the quiet hours before dawn, staring at the cracked ceiling, she never told Daniel. He was asleep beside her, his hand loosely around hers, as though even in sleep he knew she needed grounding. Days turned to weeks. Emily sent out resumes, determined to earn her place in the legal world on her own terms. Daniel picked up freelance work, sketching portraits in the park and selling modest watercolors at weekend fairs. They made rent, barely. They stretched groceries, walked instead of taking the subway, and learned the rhythm of a life measured not by status, but by survival and support. Her father did not call, not on her birthday, not when she passed the bar, not even when she published her first legal article in the Boston Law Review. Emily stopped waiting. She buried the hurt beneath casework, building a wall of effort and purpose. But sometimes in the silence between cases, in the stillness after Daniel had gone to bed, she would find herself staring at her phone, wondering if his number still worked. She never tried. Pride, she knew, was not a burden carried only by her father. Over time, the ache dulled but never disappeared. Her heart grew a new shape around it, like a tree growing around an old scar. And though she never doubted the path she chose, There were nights she wished the man who taught her how to argue, how to think and how to stand tall would appear on her doorstep, not with anger, but with understanding. But life moved forward, and Emily moved with it, refusing to let absence define her. In the warmth of Daniel's gaze, in the sound of her name read aloud in court, in the quiet confidence she carried each morning, she found the beginnings of something stronger than approval. She found herself. The studio apartment above the old bookstore became a world of its own, small but filled with quiet victories. The paint on the walls chipped in corners, and the plumbing occasionally whined in protest. But within those imperfect confines, Emily and Daniel found something stronger than convenience, resilience. The early days were lean, measured in skipped lattes and bargain groceries, but neither of them complained. They had chosen this life, and though it lacked polish, it brimmed with authenticity. Emily began working part-time at a neighborhood legal aid office while applying for full-time roles. The office was understaffed and overwhelmed, serving clients who were often desperate and voiceless, people for whom the law was more a maze than a shield. Though the work was grueling, she found purpose in it. Every case mattered. Every person she helped reminded her why she had entered law in the first place. Daniel, meanwhile, devoted himself to his art. He transformed a corner of the apartment into a studio, placing an easel by the window where sunlight filtered through during the early hours. He took odd jobs, illustrating menus for local cafes, designing flyers for community events, selling small canvases at weekend markets, but never lost sight of his vision. His hands were often stained with paint, and his clothes bore the marks of trial and error, but his eyes sparkled with quiet pride when he saw his work hanging, even in modest places. They lived with intention. Mornings began with instant coffee and shared plans for the day. Evenings ended with mismatched mugs of tea and whispered conversations under thin blankets. Their routines were humble, but they carried a rhythm that comforted them both. On weekends, they walked along the Charles River, watching the sailboats glide in the distance, speaking of future dreams. Not in abstract, grand terms, but in concrete hopes. A better job, a small gallery space, maybe a car with working heat. What they did not speak of, not directly, was Emily's father. His absence cast a long shadow, but they had learned to move around it. She never reached out, and he never replied. The letter she wrote that first winter remained folded inside her journal, unsent, its edges softened over time, the ink slightly smudged by tears from a night she did not discuss. Daniel saw the toll it took, but chose to give her space. His support was silent but steady, never pushing her toward reconciliation, yet never judging the pain that lingered. 2 years passed. Emily secured a position as a public defender with the city. The office was chaotic, underfunded, and constantly at capacity, but she thrived. Her caseload was enormous, but she handled each file with care. Colleagues took notice. Clients remembered her. She became known for listening deeply, for explaining the law in human terms, and for showing up even when hope seemed slim. Despite long hours and emotional strain, she never regretted her path. The gratitude in her clients' eyes, the occasional handwritten thank you notes left on her desk, these became the currency of her success. And with every courtroom victory, every small win for someone who felt overlooked, she built a name not inherited, but earned. Still, each personal triumph arrived with a pang. Her father never called, never wrote, never acknowledged her choices. Boston's legal community was not vast. He must have heard whispers of her growing reputation. Yet he remained silent, buried in his own world, as rigid and unreachable as ever. Sometimes she imagined what he would say if he saw her now. Would he see the strength in her decisions? Would he still view her marriage as a betrayal? Daniel watched her from the sidelines, always gentle in his encouragement, never demanding more than she could give. He continued painting, occasionally receiving commissions from private clients. His work evolved, reflecting the depth of their shared life. Portraits of street musicians, intimate domestic scenes, moments of quiet struggle and joy. His art gained attention, not in galleries or museums, but in the eyes of people who saw themselves in his work. Money remained tight, but they managed. They learned how to stretch resources, how to celebrate small luxuries, a meal out once a month, a new set of brushes, a second-hand winter coat. Their love matured, shaped by adversity and compromise. It was no longer the reckless devotion of newlyweds, but a partnership rooted in patience and shared sacrifice. Their apartment became a reflection of who they were becoming. Stacks of legal folders and half-finished paintings filled the corners. Post-it notes with court dates and sketch ideas decorated the fridge. Bookshelves sagged under the weight of law books and art history volumes. It was cluttered, chaotic, alive. In quieter moments, Emily sometimes walked past the family photograph still kept in a small box under the bed. A younger version of herself smiled beside her father at her law school graduation. He had his arm around her shoulder, his smile rare but real. She had once thought that moment marked the pinnacle of their bond. Looking at it now, it felt like a story unfinished, a chapter paused. But life did not pause. It pressed forward with deadlines, bills, birthdays, and late-night arguments over nothing. It moved with joy and weariness, with laughter in the kitchen and exhaustion at the dinner table. It was not always graceful, but it was theirs. As another year turned, they welcomed their fourth winter together. The city was dusted in snow, and their apartment remained warm only by effort. Emily bundled in layers at her desk, reviewing case files by lamplight. Daniel added final touches to a winter cityscape. Outside, sirens echoed faintly in the distance, the city never truly sleeping. Emily closed her laptop and turned toward Daniel, who looked up from his canvas. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" she asked softly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He set his brush down and walked over, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "I think," he said, "the real question is whether you'll ever stop needing his forgiveness." She looked away, blinking against tears that surprised her with their suddenness. She didn't answer, not yet, because the silence between father and daughter had become its own kind of language, a barrier, a protection, a wound. And though years had passed, its echo still lived in the space between her heartbeat and her breath. Emily turned off the lamp, crawled into bed beside Daniel, and held him just a little tighter. Emily's world took on a new rhythm as her career advanced. Each morning began before sunrise, the dark sky barely giving way to dawn as she reviewed case notes with a cup of weak coffee. The office of the public defender was a revolving door of desperation, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over lives teetering on the edge. Her caseload remained relentless, but her focus never wavered. She fought for clients others dismissed, homeless veterans, single parents facing eviction, immigrants fearing deportation. In each of them, she saw echoes of her own struggle, the quiet fight for dignity in a world that often demanded credentials over character. Her efforts began to draw attention. Judges took note of her precision, colleagues admired her resilience, and community organizations reached out for her insight. She was often invited to speak at local events, to train young interns, to consult on legislation. Yet through all of it, she remained grounded. Her clothes were simple, her office small, and her nameplate, a modest engraved rectangle, sat slightly tilted on her desk. Her reputation, however, grew with each victory. She had become the voice for those who had none, and her name, once dismissed by her father, now carried quiet weight in courtrooms across the city. Meanwhile, across the divide of silence, Richard Thompson's world looked increasingly fragile beneath its polished veneer. The prestigious law firm he had helped build decades earlier was not the fortress it once was. Behind the mahogany doors and glass-walled boardrooms, the cracks had begun to form. Younger partners questioned his leadership, murmurs of outdated practices and unwise investments whispered through hallways. He dismissed them at first. He had weathered storms before, had built a legacy on grit and strategy. But this time, the landscape was different. The legal market had shifted. Clients wanted innovation, flexibility, empathy, traits he had never prioritized. Pride had long been Richard's armor. He wore it like a suit of iron, forged over years of courtroom victories and flawless negotiations. But beneath that armor, something had changed. He aged without softness, each year carving deeper lines into his face, each loss chipping at his once unshakable resolve. He no longer attended the annual Bar Association dinners. The invitations arrived, but he declined them without reading. He preferred the silence of his office, where accolades hung on the walls like fading memories. Despite the collapse of their relationship, Emily's name reached him now and then, mentioned in passing during client meetings, overheard in courthouse hallways. He pretended not to listen, but every mention lingered. He knew she had become a respected public defender. He had heard she had argued a case before the state appellate court and won. He said nothing. He felt too much. Regret had taken root where pride once stood. Yet still, he did not call. The silence, once his defense, had become a sentence he no longer knew how to commute. Back in Cambridge, Daniel's life unfolded in a gentler cadence. His art matured alongside their marriage, his canvases revealing deeper stories with every brushstroke. He moved beyond street fairs. His work now featured in local cafes, small exhibitions, and the occasional commissioned piece for clients who appreciated his eye for quiet detail. He never chased fame. For him, the value of art lay in the connection it sparked, the emotions it evoked. He often painted while Emily prepared closing arguments or drafted briefs, the two of them sharing space in the comfort of long silences and occasional glances. They lived modestly still, but with a greater sense of stability. The apartment had changed, walls painted fresh, a new desk for Emily, proper lighting for Daniel's studio. Their bookshelf now included law journals, art catalogues, and children's stories, hopeful hints of the future. Conversations turned gently to what might come next, perhaps a house in the suburbs, perhaps a child. They spoke in possibilities, no longer burdened by the urgency of survival. Emily's dedication, however, came at a cost. The demands of the job began to wear on her. Sleepless nights grew more frequent, and the weight of her clients' stories crept into her dreams. She became known for carrying her files everywhere, on the subway, at dinner, even during brief vacations. Daniel watched with concern, proud of her strength, but mindful of its toll. He began to cook more, to handle errands, to remind her to breathe. He never asked her to slow down. He simply made space for her to keep going. Occasionally, Emily still thought of her father, not in anger, but in the quiet moments when she witnessed other families reunite after hardship. She saw fathers embracing sons after custody cases, mothers weeping when debts were erased. Each reunion felt like a mirror turned toward her own absence. She wondered what her father would say if he knew the cases she had taken, the people she had helped. Would he be proud? Or would he see only the path not taken, the corporate ladder, the firm she refused, the clients she could have courted? That question stayed unanswered. She no longer expected a phone call. She had learned to live with silence, to fill its void with purpose. Yet deep down, the longing remained, not for validation, but for acknowledgement, for some gesture that their bond, once so formative, had not been entirely erased. Years slipped by, marked not by birthdays or holidays, but by court victories and gallery openings. Life moved forward on separate tracks, Emily's paved with legal briefings and late nights, Richard's with aging regrets and hollow routines. Neither reached across the chasm, neither knew how, but the city, in its strange and silent way, kept pulling them closer. Their paths, though distant, began to circle the same intersections. Names passed over benches, articles read in legal newsletters, faces glimpsed in public forums. Neither of them knew it yet, but the distance between them was beginning to shrink, quietly, inevitably. The winter had been relentless, and Boston wore a coat of gray that seemed to deepen with each passing week. On a Monday morning, just after 7 o'clock, Emily stepped into the courthouse with her coat dusted in snow and her briefcase packed tight with documents that had kept her awake through most of the weekend. She had been assigned a case that was rapidly gaining public attention, not because of its legal complexity, but because of the human story it carried. It involved a woman named Marisol Vega, a single mother of two who had spent the last decade working as a home health aide, quietly supporting elderly clients while barely keeping a roof over her own head. The property she lived in was part of a long-disputed estate, one of dozens targeted by a corporation known for snapping up old buildings and pushing tenants out through procedural loopholes. Marisol had received an eviction notice with only 7 days to respond. She had no lawyer, no savings, and no one to turn to until she walked into the public defender's office, terrified and confused. Emily had met her on a Thursday morning, seated in the waiting area with her hands clutched tightly in her lap. Her face was worn, not from age but from years of invisible labor, and her voice trembled as she described her situation. Emily had listened carefully, jotting notes while asking pointed but gentle questions. By the end of the hour, she had made a decision. She would not delegate the case. She would represent Marisol herself. In the days that followed, Emily immersed herself in the details, examining ownership records, digging through housing code violations, reviewing correspondence from the management company. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Marisol was not simply being evicted, she was being erased. The company had used a combination of legal pressure and misinformation to force her into surrendering her rights without a fight. Emily knew the courtroom would not be easy, but she also knew that justice wasn't always about winning. It was about standing firm when others couldn't. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. As the date approached, local news outlets began reporting on the broader issue of tenant displacement. Marisol's case was mentioned in a growing chorus of stories that painted a picture of a city increasingly hostile to its working-class residents. Emily found herself quoted in one such article, her statement simple but firm. The law must protect not just property, but people. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but the attention arrived all the same. The day of the hearing brought a crowd to the courthouse steps. Housing advocates, local reporters, and curious citizens gathered, some holding signs, others simply watching. Emily arrived early, her notes in hand and her resolve steady. Marisol sat beside her at the defense table, visibly nervous but trying to stay composed. Emily placed a reassuring hand on hers before standing to address the judge. She began not with legal jargon, but with a story. She spoke of Marisol's years of quiet service, her taxes paid, her children raised without complaint. She detailed the inconsistencies in the eviction process, pointing out dates that didn't align, notices that lacked proper signatures, and violations that had gone unaddressed. She spoke plainly, but with urgency, weaving facts and emotion into a tapestry that left the room silent. The opposing counsel, a slick attorney representing the development company, countered with technicalities. He referred to statutes, cited deadlines, and implied negligence on Marisol's part. But the courtroom felt the difference between argument and advocacy. Emily wasn't defending a theory, she was defending a life. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was measured, but his words clear. He ruled in favor of Marisol, citing procedural errors and a failure on the landlord's part to meet the city's housing standards. He added a stern warning regarding tenant protections and the ethical responsibilities of corporate landlords. The gavel struck, and just like that, Marisol's home was no longer under threat. A hush fell over the courtroom before it broke into a ripple of relief. Marisol cried silently, covering her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. Emily remained composed, but her heart pounded with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Outside, reporters waited, eager for a quote. She stepped into the cold afternoon air and, when asked for a comment, repeated what she had told the court. "This isn't just about one tenant. It's about the value we place on every person who calls this city home." The story aired on local news that evening, with Emily's name spoken by anchors who had never heard of her until that day. Colleagues reached out to congratulate her. Community organizations offered to collaborate. Within her office, younger attorneys asked to shadow her in court. She accepted none of the attention as a victory. She viewed it instead as a responsibility. At home that night, Daniel met her at the door with a quiet smile. He had seen the segment on television and paused it on her closing statement. She watched it once before asking him to turn it off. She didn't need to see herself on a screen to know what the case had meant. They ate dinner in the soft quiet of their apartment, a modest celebration of a moment that had been years in the making. Later, she sat at her desk and added the case file to a growing archive she kept organized in plastic bins under the bed. Each file told a story of someone who had faced a system built to exclude them. Each name was a reminder of why she stayed in this work, even when it drained her. She thought briefly of her father, of how he would have dissected the ruling, scrutinized her courtroom tactics, questioned her emotional tone. But then she imagined, just for a moment, that he might have felt pride. Not the kind shown in applause, but the silent kind, unspoken, yet present. But she did not dwell. The next case was already waiting. The next name. The next fight. She had chosen this path not for recognition, but because justice for her was never abstract. It was personal. It was lived. And for Marisol Vega, it had just become real. A few blocks away in a quiet corner of the city, Richard Thompson sat at his desk, leafing through the morning paper. His eyes fell on a headline he nearly skipped, one about housing and tenants' rights. He read the article without realizing who it mentioned until her name appeared near the end. He paused, blinked, read it again. For a long time he sat still, staring at the words. Then he folded the paper carefully and placed it aside, saying nothing. The letter was folded twice and buried between the pages of an old legal ethics textbook Emily hadn't touched in years. She discovered it on a quiet Sunday afternoon while cleaning the living room bookshelf, her fingers brushing against the aged cover, pulling it free from a row of other volumes she had read more out of obligation than desire. The moment she opened the book, it slipped out like something trying to return to the world. She stared at it, recognizing her own handwriting instantly. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, and the ink had faded just enough to soften her words. She did not need to read it to remember what it said. She had written it nearly 3 years earlier, within weeks of her final conversation with her father, when the anger was still fresh, when she still thought a letter might bridge a silence that pride had turned into an ocean. Daniel found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, the letter open in her hands, her eyes not wet but distant. He sat beside her without asking, simply waiting. After a moment, she handed him the page. He read it slowly, his thumb brushing the edge as he turned it over, then back again. "I never sent it," she said, her voice low. "I wanted to. I remember sealing the envelope, even putting a stamp on it, but I couldn't bring myself to drop it in the mailbox." Daniel didn't press for reasons. He understood that some wounds resist healing, not for lack of medicine, but for fear of reopening what has long been scabbed over. He read the letter once more before folding it neatly and setting it on the coffee table. "Maybe now is the time," he said gently. Emily shook her head. "It's been too long, too much has happened. But not too much to be forgiven," he said. "At least not too much to try." The letter wasn't dramatic. It was earnest, vulnerable in a way Emily rarely allowed herself to be. She had written about her decision, about Daniel, about how she missed Sunday mornings at the kitchen table and the smell of her father's aftershave when he left for court. She had asked for nothing, only said she hoped one day he could understand. Later that evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone in the living room. The envelope rested on the table, untouched. He stared at it for a long while, weighing the silence that had grown over the years against the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, her father might need the words as much as she once did. He rose quietly, slipped on his coat, and left the apartment. The mailbox on the corner was still there, rusted at the bottom, worn from years of weather. He slid the envelope in without hesitation and walked back home beneath the city's flickering streetlights, never once doubting his choice. Days passed, then a week. Emily noticed nothing unusual. She continued her work with unwavering discipline, taking on another round of cases that demanded her full attention. Court hearings, interviews, and late nights occupied her schedule. The letter remained unspoken, its journey unknown. One morning, as she sipped coffee while reviewing depositions, she paused briefly, a strange sensation settling in her chest, like remembering something forgotten, though she couldn't place it. Daniel noticed the shift in her expression but said nothing. At the other end of the city, Richard Thompson checked his mail late, as he often did now. The habit of scanning letters for client names or court notices had not left him, even as his days grew quieter. He rarely received anything personal, mostly firm correspondence, financial statements, legal updates. When he saw the envelope with Emily's handwriting, he froze. The stamp was ordinary, the postmark recent. His hands trembled slightly as he tore it open. Reading it was not easy. Her words were gentle, but they struck chords he had locked away. She spoke of love, of hurt, of decisions made not to defy, but to follow her heart. She had not asked for forgiveness. She had not accused him of anything, and that perhaps was what made the letter so disarming. He read it 3 times, the first with skepticism, the second with anger, and the third with a deep, aching sorrow. He wanted to respond. He wanted to call. He even sat at his desk, pen in hand, unsure of where to begin. But the years had buried his instincts beneath layers of pride and solitude. Instead of writing back, he placed the letter on his nightstand, where it remained, folded beside his reading glasses. Emily, unaware that her words had finally reached him, continued her routine. Nothing in her life suggested change. She still rose early, still took the train, still fought for those who had no voice. But something in her had shifted, small, imperceptible but real, a quiet lifting of weight she had carried for too long. One evening, while reorganizing a stack of legal pads on the kitchen counter, Daniel casually asked, "Have you thought about him lately?" She looked up, surprised by the question. "Not in any specific way," she said. "Why?" He hesitated. "Just wondering if you ever think about sending that letter." She narrowed her eyes slightly, then tilted her head. "Daniel, did you—" "I did," he said before she could finish. "I mailed it. I thought maybe it was time." Her first reaction was silence, then disbelief, then a slow exhale that seemed to empty more than her lungs. "I don't know if I'm angry or grateful," she said, her voice even. "Maybe both," he replied, "maybe neither." They didn't speak of it again that night. But the next morning, as she rode the train to work, Emily found herself staring out the window longer than usual, watching the city blur past. She wondered if he had read it, if he had kept it, if he had felt anything at all. Richard, for his part, began rereading the letter each night before bed. He did not know what he was waiting for. He had not spoken her name aloud in years. But now, alone in his large and empty house, her words echoed in ways he could no longer ignore. He read the final line more often than the rest. "Even if you never respond, I needed you to know. I never stopped being your daughter." And in that line, something cracked. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. But it was a beginning. For most of his professional life, Richard Thompson had walked through the marble lobby of his law firm with the confident pace of someone who believed the ground itself owed him deference. His name, etched in gold on the building's entrance alongside two now-deceased partners, had once stood as a symbol of prestige. But as the winter deepened and the city around him moved with indifferent haste, Richard began to notice the changes he had long tried to ignore. Doors that once swung open before he reached them now remained still. Conversations quieted when he entered a room, but not out of respect, out of calculation. The first real sign came with a letter from the firm's managing committee. It was direct, devoid of pleasantries, outlining concerns regarding ongoing client satisfaction and recent misallocation of firm funds. Richard read it twice, his eyes narrowing at every phrase that struck like a veiled accusation. He was being investigated, not by authorities, not yet, but by his own colleagues, men and women he had mentored, who now seemed eager to disassociate themselves from him. He brushed it off publicly, assuring those who asked that it was a procedural review. But internally, he knew better. For months, he had been steering investments into a real estate venture recommended by a long-trusted client. The returns had been promised as rapid and significant. But when the market shifted and zoning permits were revoked, the project collapsed. The client disappeared, and with him nearly $500,000 of the firm's capital, money that Richard had allocated without full disclosure. He had always prided himself on control. Every motion, every argument, every financial move had once been measured with precision. But age, arrogance, and perhaps an unwillingness to adapt had eroded that edge. Now, for the first time, he stood on uncertain ground. Weeks passed. Then the letters turned to summons. The firm filed an internal complaint, followed by a civil suit. The story broke in the legal press, followed quickly by local news outlets. "Respected Boston attorney under fire for alleged financial misconduct," the headline read, accompanied by a photo of him entering his car, his expression stoic but tense. He refused interviews, issued a brief denial through his assistant, and tried to retreat into routine. But routine no longer served him. Clients canceled appointments. Junior associates stopped seeking his guidance. Invitations ceased. The corner office that once bustled with influence became a quiet space where dust settled faster than conversations. At home, the silence was heavier. The house, too large for one person, became a museum of a life lived in certainty. He pored over documents at the dining room table, trying to piece together a defense, but the facts would not bend in his favor. The financial records were clear, the decisions traceable. His name, once a shield, had become a liability. One morning, he received notice that the Massachusetts Bar Association would begin formal disciplinary hearings. Disbarment was not yet guaranteed, but the mere possibility was enough to cause murmurs in every courtroom he once dominated. The fall was no longer speculative, it had begun. Desperation crept in slowly. He reached out to the client who had led him into the failed investment. The calls went unanswered. The address listed on their last agreement had been vacated. Legal recourse was possible but unlikely. The man had vanished, taking with him not just money, but Richard's credibility. His personal finances, long intertwined with the firm, began to unravel. Bank accounts were frozen as part of a broader audit. Creditors emerged from the shadows. Even his home, long paid off, was not immune. Liens appeared, letters from financial institutions piled on his desk. He responded to none of them. In a moment of reluctant vulnerability, he called an old colleague, a retired judge who had once clerked with him in their early careers. The voice on the other end was cautious, kind, but distant. They spoke for less than 5 minutes. The message was clear. Help would not come from familiar places. His days became quiet routines of avoidance. He no longer went to the office. He answered only select emails. His suits, once custom-pressed, hung untouched in his closet. Meals were irregular. Sleep came in broken stretches. He tried reading, then stopped. He watched the evening news without sound, eyes unfocused. Amid this dissent, the letter from Emily remained on his nightstand. It had become a strange source of gravity in his unraveling world. Each night he opened it, reread her words, and folded it again with care. He had not responded. He did not know how, but it lingered, refusing to be buried under the weight of disgrace. One morning, a formal envelope arrived bearing the insignia of the bankruptcy court. It was not unexpected. The filing had been initiated by a partner seeking restitution for firm losses. Richard stared at the paper in his hand and realized that this was no longer about reputation. It was about survival. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. He spent the next weeks in preparation, though not with the sharpness that once defined him. His notes were disorganized, his thoughts scattered. He refused legal representation, believing that no one else could defend him better. But even he knew this was pride masking fear. The night before the hearing, he sat at his desk until the early hours of the morning. He reviewed every financial document, every email, every record he could still access. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, eyes dry and mind numb, he whispered her name, not as a plea, but as a recognition of what he had lost long before the money, long before the firm. "Emily," he said softly into the quiet. He had no idea that she would be in the courtroom that day. A tempest was gathering around Richard Thompson, and though he had braved many storms, this one was different. It was not professional, it was personal. And it was about to place him in the very position he had once held in judgment over so many others. Seated before a judge, stripped of control, forced to reckon not only with his actions, but with the years of silence that had come before them. The courtroom on the 3rd floor of the old Suffolk County Courthouse had an atmosphere that mixed authority with fatigue. The walls bore the marks of countless hearings, and the wooden benches had absorbed the weight of generations seeking justice or bracing for judgment. It was a space where humanity played out in measured voices and clerical stamps, where lives shifted on the strength of argument or the absence of it. On a chilly Thursday morning, just past 8 o'clock, Emily walked through the heavy double doors of that courtroom with the quiet confidence that had become her signature. She had been recently appointed as a rotating presiding judge for civil overflow hearings. A temporary assignment, but one that came with increased responsibility. Her docket was full of urgent bankruptcy claims, evictions, and financial disputes. The cases were rarely glamorous, often involving overwhelmed petitioners and disheveled lawyers trying to navigate tight deadlines. Still, Emily approached each file with the same diligence. Every case deserved her full attention, regardless of the name at the top. That morning her robe felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the weather, or perhaps the weight of the stories she had read late into the night. She had skimmed the docket briefly before entering, recognizing none of the names. She always tried to keep her expectations clear of assumptions. Every person who entered her courtroom brought with them a history. Some were in free fall. Others were clinging to the last threads of stability. She knew this from experience, not only through law, but through life. As the first case was called and the attorneys introduced themselves, Emily focused entirely on the matter at hand. Her voice was steady, her posture formal but not cold. She made eye contact with each participant, giving them the dignity often denied in moments of personal collapse. Case by case, she moved through the morning with professionalism and clarity, offering decisions rooted in fairness and reason. Among the observers seated in the back row was a man who had not entered a courtroom in over a year. Richard Thompson sat still, shoulders slightly hunched, his coat neatly folded on his lap. He had arrived early, unsure of what he was looking for. He had read the docket, the public record confirming her assignment, and though the list of cases did not include his, he felt compelled to be there. He did not sit close. He did not make his presence known. But when Emily entered, he felt the breath catch in his throat. He had not seen her in person since the day she left his house. Years had aged her, but only slightly. She carried herself with poise he barely recognized, her eyes sharper, her demeanor composed. She looked nothing like the daughter he had once chastised for dreaming too small. She looked like someone who had built her life brick by brick, without asking for his approval. Emily did not see him. Her focus remained on the proceedings. But occasionally, her gaze drifted toward the back rows as though sensing something unfamiliar. Each time she quickly returned to the files in front of her, unaware that the man watching her was the same one whose absence had shaped so much of her adult life. Richard watched as she ruled on a complicated joint filing involving a retired couple and a predatory loan scheme. Her questions were precise, her tone neither sympathetic nor harsh. When she delivered her decision, one that offered the couple a reprieve without absolving all responsibility, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride, at least not in the way he used to define it. It was something quieter, regret perhaps, or awe. When court recessed for a brief break, Emily stepped into chambers to review notes for the next round of hearings. She still had no idea he was there. She poured herself a small cup of lukewarm coffee, reviewing the file that bore the name Richard H. Thompson. The document was sparse, lacking legal representation, handwritten annotations dotting the margins. She furrowed her brow. There was something oddly familiar about the handwriting, about the language used in the summary declaration. She dismissed the thought. Coincidences happened. Back in the courtroom, Richard remained seated. He had no intention of approaching her. He did not trust himself to speak. But when the clerk called his name for the upcoming hearing, he flinched. The moment had arrived, sooner than expected. The walk from his bench to the petitioner's table felt longer than any he had taken before. As he stood, Emily returned from chambers, taking her seat with practiced grace. She looked down at the case file. Her eyes stopped moving. The name sat there, in bold letters, undeniable. She blinked once. Her breath paused. She looked up, slowly, and for the first time in years their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. The courtroom, unaware of the silent collision unfolding before it, carried on around them. The clerk began reading the summary of the case. Richard stood frozen, unable to meet her gaze again. Emily, for a long moment, said nothing. Then, gathering herself, she shifted in her chair and cleared her throat. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice even, "do you wish to proceed without representation?" He nodded once, still unable to speak. The clerk continued. Emily resumed the formalities, reciting the case number, confirming the filings, outlining the procedures. Her voice held firm, though her hands felt cold. She kept her expression neutral, forcing every word to remain grounded in professionalism. Not once did she let the room glimpse what was unraveling behind her composed exterior. Richard spoke only when asked. His responses were brief, his tone subdued. Emily noted the fatigue in his posture, the fragility in his presence. She did not look at him as a daughter. She looked at him as a judge. That, she decided, was the only way she could hold herself together. The hearing concluded quickly. There were procedural delays that would require a continuation. Emily scheduled the next session for 3 weeks later. She offered no commentary beyond what was required. As she rose to leave, Richard remained still. His eyes followed her as she exited, but he did not call out. Back in chambers, Emily shut the door and leaned against it, heart racing. The silence was thick. The past had just walked into her courtroom and sat 10 feet away. The man she had once loved with blind devotion, whose absence had shaped her understanding of loyalty, had looked at her with the eyes of someone who no longer knew what to say. She sank into her chair, stared at the file, and for the first time in a long while, felt the walls between who she had become and where she came from begin to crack. The days following the hearing passed in a haze for both Richard and Emily. On paper, it had been nothing more than another bankruptcy proceeding, one of dozens Emily had presided over that month. But beneath the surface, it reverberated like a low, persistent echo neither of them could silence. For Richard, the shock of seeing his daughter in a position of judicial authority, her presence commanding, her words absolute, struck a blow deeper than any legal defeat. And for Emily, the sudden reappearance of the man who had defined so much of her pain felt like a reckoning long postponed. 3 weeks later, the courtroom lights once again flickered on just before 9 o'clock. Outside, the winter was beginning to break, but inside, the weight of unresolved things hung thick in the air. Emily reviewed her docket with measured calm. Richard's name sat at the bottom of the schedule, the final case before recess. She had rehearsed no script, made no assumptions. She told herself she was prepared to remain detached, to maintain the boundary between law and memory. But a part of her, however well guarded, braced for something more than paperwork. Richard arrived early again, dressed in the same charcoal grey coat he had worn before, his face pale beneath the courtroom's fluorescent lights. He clutched a small folder filled with documents he had gathered in the hope of defending himself. They were neatly organized but irrelevant, and he knew it. His situation had only worsened. The audit had revealed more inconsistencies. The court had received claims from former colleagues alleging negligence. His last private account had been frozen the previous week, and he now lived off the limited cash he had managed to withdraw before the banks caught up with him. He sat in silence as other hearings unfolded, barely registering the voices around him. He did not look up when his name was called. He rose slowly, walking toward the front with the heavy gait of a man whose balance had been taken, not by one event, but by a sequence of losses, none of which he had stopped in time. Emily watched him approach, her expression unreadable. She gestured for him to be seated, then opened the folder in front of her. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice steady, "you have submitted a revised financial statement since your last appearance. Is that correct?" He nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Emily reviewed the papers without expression. There was little left to contest. The liabilities were overwhelming, the assets nearly non-existent. The firm's civil case remained pending, but the bankruptcy proceedings had now taken precedence. She outlined the findings of the review, each point delivered in precise clinical language. Richard listened without interruption, but as she spoke, a faint tremor began in his right hand. He folded it beneath the table, trying to steady himself. His heart was racing and his vision blurred slightly. He swallowed hard, trying to remain upright, but the pressure in his chest intensified. The courtroom around him seemed to dim, the sounds retreating as if underwater. Emily reached the conclusion of her summary, pausing briefly to allow the court recorder to catch up. She looked up, intending to ask Richard if he wished to make a closing statement. But something about his stillness gave her pause. His eyes were fixed on the floor, unfocused. His face had gone white. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked. He did not respond. "Mr. Thompson," she repeated, this time louder, rising slightly from her chair. His body slumped forward, the folder slipping from his hands as he collapsed against the table. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Emily froze for less than a second, her instincts locking between roles. Then she acted. "Call emergency services," she ordered, her voice firm but urgent. She stepped down from the bench and crossed to where he lay, slumped, unresponsive. A bailiff moved in quickly, checking his pulse. Emily knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Paramedics arrived within minutes. The room was cleared except for essential personnel. Emily stood back as they worked, watching silently as her father, the man who once ruled boardrooms and courtrooms alike, was placed gently onto a stretcher. His breathing was shallow, his face ghostly. She said nothing to the medics. She offered no personal detail, no revelation of their connection. When asked if she was the presiding judge, she simply nodded. They carried him out without knowing the weight he carried, not just in medical terms, but in the burden of years lost. The courtroom was silent long after he had gone. Emily returned to the bench slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted her papers. The clerk offered to adjourn the remaining docket, but she refused. There was one final case, and she intended to finish the morning as she began it. Composed, professional, contained. Only when she returned to chambers did the shock begin to settle into her bones. She sat at her desk, staring at nothing, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She thought of the letter, of the hearing, of the look in his eyes when he first recognized her. She remembered his silence that day in the courtroom, how much it resembled the years of absence that had come before. Later that evening, after returning home, she told Daniel everything. The collapse, the ambulance, the tremor in her own voice. He listened without interruption, holding her hand gently across the kitchen table. When she finished, she leaned into his shoulder and whispered what she had not dared say aloud until then. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," Daniel responded without hesitation. "You don't have to know. Not yet." At the hospital, Richard regained consciousness hours after being admitted. The doctors called it a cardiac episode brought on by stress and exhaustion. They spoke in careful terms, avoiding predictions. He was stable but weakened. As he lay in the dim hospital room, the beeping of machines around him, he turned his head toward the small window. Snow fell softly outside. The light was pale, distant. He closed his eyes and whispered the only name that still lingered when everything else had been stripped away: Emily. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady hum of machinery. It was the kind of silence that held weight, not emptiness. The kind that suggested something was being held back, waiting for the right moment to surface. Richard lay still, the white sheets pulled up to his chest, his eyes half open, tracing the ceiling without focus. His body felt foreign to him, weaker than he had ever known it could become. The rhythm of the machines was a reminder that he no longer controlled the tempo of his own life. The doctors said the episode had not been a full heart attack, but something close, a warning. His body had buckled under years of strain, stress, and refusal to stop. They had used phrases like precautionary monitoring, mild arrhythmia, and significant fatigue. He barely listened. What echoed most was the look in Emily's eyes when he had last seen her in court. She had not flinched, not faltered, but he had seen it. The shadow of recognition, the brief flicker of something beyond her judicial role. It had haunted him in the hours since he collapsed, more than the pain, more than the shame. Emily arrived at the hospital that evening, long after visiting hours had ended. Her name had been left at the front desk by a nurse who seemed to sense there was something unresolved between the judge and the patient in room 412. She did not bring flowers or a card. She carried only her coat draped over one arm and a small notebook tucked into her bag. When she stepped into the room, she hesitated for just a moment before closing the door behind her. Richard turned his head slowly. When he saw her, he did not speak. His expression shifted: relief, regret, something softer than apology, something harder than pride. Emily crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his bed. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. "I didn't think you'd come," he said at last, his voice raspy. "I wasn't sure I would," she replied. Another pause. The machines beeped steadily. "You looked different in court," he said, not as a criticism but as an observation. Older, stronger. Emily nodded once. "It's been a long time. I saw that letter again," he added. "The one you wrote." Emily's gaze drifted to the window, where the lights of the city flickered through a thin layer of frost. "You never answered." "I didn't know how," he said. "I still don't." There was no anger in her voice when she spoke next, only weariness. "I wasn't asking you to fix anything. I just wanted you to know I wasn't lost." "You weren't," he said quietly, "but I was." She looked at him then, not as a judge, not as someone who had endured years of silence, but as the daughter of a man who had once been the center of her world. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, the edges of his strength worn away by time and consequence. "I thought about calling," he said, "after the letter, after I saw the article about the housing case, but I kept telling myself, you didn't want to hear from me." "I didn't know what I wanted," she admitted, "but I kept hoping you'd reach out." His eyes welled with unshed tears. "I was wrong, Emily, not just about Daniel, about everything, about what mattered. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was teaching you strength, but all I was doing was building walls." She listened without interruption. For the first time, he wasn't speaking to argue or to instruct. He was simply speaking. "When your mother died," he continued, "I lost the one person who could remind me to soften. I didn't know how to be a father without her. I buried myself in work, and when you chose a different life, I saw it as a betrayal, but it wasn't. It was bravery." Emily's throat tightened. The words she had longed to hear for years now sat heavy in the air between them. She did not know how to answer. She reached for the cup of water on the bedside table and handed it to him. He took it with a trembling hand and drank slowly. "Daniel's a good man," he said. "I should have seen that." "You never gave him a chance," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't give you one either." She let those words hang. Then she spoke, measured but honest. "I don't need an apology. I needed a father who could see me, who could love me without conditions." "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry I wasn't that man." Neither of them cried. The moment was too fragile for tears. Instead, they sat together in a silence that no longer felt like avoidance, but like something shared. After a while, she stood. "You'll need help when you're discharged. You can't go back to that house alone." "I have nowhere else," he said. She nodded. "I made arrangements. There's a senior housing program through the city. It's temporary, but it's safe and clean. You'll have privacy." He looked at her, startled. "You did that?" "I didn't want you ending up in a shelter," she said. "It doesn't change anything from the past, but it's what needed to be done." He reached for her hand, and for a moment she let him hold it. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. She hesitated. "Because despite everything, you're still my father." She turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "I left something in the drawer," she said. "You can read it later." After she left, Richard opened the drawer beside the bed. Inside was an envelope with his name written in her handwriting. He opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not legal language, not a letter of demand. It was a note, brief and simple. "You'll always have a home with me, Dad." He held the note in his hands for a long time, the tears finally coming, silently, without resistance. And for the first time in years, he let himself feel the full weight of all he had lost, and all that still remained. The news spread quickly, carried by the quiet efficiency of courthouse rumor and the more deliberate hum of local journalism. It began as a brief mention in a legal blog. A respected judge had presided over a bankruptcy hearing in which the petitioner, a once prominent attorney, had collapsed mid-session. The story contained no names, no sensationalism, only the outline of a moment that had startled an otherwise routine courtroom. But the details did not remain anonymous for long. Within days, a second article appeared in the Metro section of the Boston Daily Chronicle. This time, names were included. The writer, a well-informed legal correspondent with deep ties in the courthouse, connected the dots. Judge Emily Thompson, rising figure in public defense and now interim civil court judge, had been overseeing a hearing for Richard H. Thompson, her father, and once one of the city's most well-known legal minds. The article was restrained, professional, almost surgical in its precision. It did not speculate, it simply stated the facts. Still, the implications were impossible to ignore. Emily was at her desk the morning the article was published, reading through witness affidavits for an unrelated eviction case, when her phone began buzzing with unusual frequency. Emails marked "important" flooded her inbox, some from colleagues, others from press outlets requesting comment. Her office assistant entered the room slowly, a folded copy of the Chronicle in her hand. "They printed it," she said softly, placing the paper on Emily's desk. Emily stared at the headline for several seconds before picking it up. Her photograph accompanied the article, a cropped image from a recent courthouse event, positioned just above a decades-old photo of her father, taken at the peak of his career. The contrast was jarring. One face fresh with determination, the other weathered by time and collapse. The phone rang again. She silenced it. Her first instinct was to retreat, to push the article away and bury herself in the cases still demanding her attention. But she knew better. Avoidance would only deepen the public's hunger. Silence could be misinterpreted. She needed to act, not to explain herself, but to anchor the narrative before it spiraled beyond her control. That afternoon, she issued a brief written statement through the court's communications office. It read, The personal connection between Judge Emily Thompson and Mr. Richard H. Thompson was unknown to the presiding court at the time of the hearing and had no impact on the legal procedures conducted that day. Judge Thompson remains committed to the integrity of the court and the responsibilities of her role. No further comment will be made regarding this private matter. It was a calculated response, composed with precision. She had rewritten it 3 times, each version tighter than the last. It offered no apology, no elaboration, no emotional window. It was the language of the law, measured, impersonal, final. Privately, however, the situation gnawed at her. She had spent years building a name distinct from her father's legacy. She had labored not to erase him, but to grow separate from the shadow he cast. Now, with a single article, the worlds she had kept apart were colliding. Her courtroom had always been a space of structure and neutrality, her home, a sanctuary from the past. But the boundary was fraying, and she felt the tension in every word she spoke, every glance from colleagues that lingered a beat too long. Daniel was supportive, as always. That evening he cooked dinner and waited patiently for her to speak. When she finally did, it was with a quiet exhaustion. "It's not just the story," she said. "It's what it represents, how fragile the separation is, between who I am and who people think I was trying not to be." Daniel placed a glass of water in front of her. "You're not defined by him, you never were." "But it's different now," she said. "The courtroom isn't supposed to be personal, and now it is." "You didn't ask for that," he said. "You just did your job. You didn't exploit it. You didn't run from it." "I don't know if that's enough," she replied. "I've worked so hard to build credibility, and now people are whispering that I shouldn't have taken the case." Daniel reached across the table and touched her hand. "Let them whisper. The people who matter, the clients, the community, you've shown them who you are. That can't be undone by a headline." She didn't respond, but the next morning, she returned to court with her shoulders squared and her head held high. She greeted the bailiff by name. She listened attentively during hearings. She maintained her rhythm, determined to reclaim the space that had always felt like hers. Still, the impact of the article lingered. In the following days, she was approached by fellow judges, some offering support, others probing subtly for more details. Her supervisor asked if she wanted a brief reassignment while the media interest faded. She declined. "I'm not stepping aside," she said. "There's no conflict, there's only speculation." And so she stayed. She showed up each day with the same level of diligence, the same clarity of judgment. Slowly, the noise began to fade. Another news cycle took hold. The press moved on, and within the courtroom, where actions spoke louder than backstories, respect for her remained intact. But in private, something had shifted between her and Richard. He had read the article too. He had seen her statement. And though they did not speak for several days, the next time she visited his hospital room, the first thing he said was, "You didn't have to protect me." "I wasn't protecting you," she replied. "I was protecting the court and myself." He nodded, understanding the distinction. "You were fair," he said. "You always were." This time, they sat together without tension. No past to dissect. No accusations to level. Just 2 people sitting in the aftermath of a moment that neither of them had expected, but both had somehow survived. She left that day without ceremony, just a quiet goodbye and a promise to visit again. And as she stepped into the winter light outside the hospital, she felt a calm she hadn't known in weeks. Her worlds had collided, yes, but they had not collapsed. They had begun, perhaps, to merge. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year, as if reluctant to release the city from its grey stillness. But within the quiet thaw, something subtle began to shift in Richard's life. The days following his release from the hospital passed without fanfare. He was discharged under medical recommendation to avoid stress, physical exertion, and any attempt to resume his old routines. The house that once symbolized his success now stood shuttered, inaccessible, locked behind court orders and frozen accounts. He left it without resistance, carrying only a duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, his reading glasses and the letter from Emily folded inside a side pocket. The city-sponsored senior housing complex was located in Dorchester, tucked behind a small park and within walking distance of a bus stop. It was a far cry from the townhouse in Back Bay, but it was warm, clean, and filled with residents who, like him, had stories that stretched longer than most cared to ask. The room was modest, a single bed, a desk, a dresser, and a small kitchenette, but it was more than he had expected. The welcome packet left on the desk included a schedule of community meals, a list of support groups, and a note clipped to the front. Arranged by Emily Thompson. For a long time, Richard stared at the note. He sat on the edge of the bed with the slip of paper in his hands, reading and rereading the handwriting he now knew better than his own signature. There was nothing else written, no explanation, no added flourish. Just her name and the confirmation that she had taken this step, quietly, without obligation, and without making it a point of discussion. The first few nights were difficult. He slept lightly, waking at every creak of the building, every whisper of wind against the windows. But there was also something unfamiliar about the quiet. It wasn't the silence of shame or isolation. It was a kind of space, room to consider what came next. He began keeping a small notebook beside his bed, writing a few sentences each morning, trying to piece together the fragments of thought that now surfaced in the absence of the constant noise that had once filled his days. He did not call Emily. He sensed she needed time just as he did, but he began to respond in his own way. One afternoon he mailed her a postcard, not with an apology, not with a request, but with a brief message written in his now careful hand. "The room is small, but the air is clear. I hope you're well. Dad." She received it 3 days later and placed it on her desk beside a framed photograph of her children. She did not write back immediately. Instead, she added the card to a drawer already containing the note he had once left unread, the letter she had written years ago, and a few old family photos she had never been able to discard. The drawer had become something like a private archive, not of sorrow but of memory, some broken, some mending. A week passed before she reached out again. The message was brief. "Dinner at our place this Sunday. 6 o'clock. The kids would like to meet you." Richard read the message twice before believing it. He placed the phone down and stood in the center of his small room, staring at the calendar on the wall. For a moment he was unsure how to feel. Nervous, yes. Grateful, certainly. But also something deeper. A sense of something reopening that he had long assumed was closed for good. Sunday arrived with a clear sky and the hint of spring in the air. Richard wore his best blazer, the one he had salvaged from storage before leaving the townhouse. It fit looser than it used to, but he pressed it carefully and cleaned the shoes he hadn't worn since the hearing. The taxi ride to Emily's home was quiet. He kept his hands folded in his lap, rehearsing greetings that all sounded inadequate. When the car pulled up to a narrow townhouse near Jamaica Plain, he hesitated before stepping out. The house was modest, with a porch lined by potted plants and the faint sound of music drifting from an open window. He climbed the steps slowly, rang the bell, and waited. Emily opened the door. She did not smile immediately, nor did she pause. She simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." He entered cautiously, taking in the warmth of the home, the scent of something baking, the soft light, the low murmur of children's voices from another room. It was a house full of life, full of decisions made independently of him, and yet now for the first time he was being invited into it. Daniel appeared in the hallway, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. He extended a hand. "Richard, welcome." Richard took it with a slight nod. "Thank you." Their handshake was firm, brief, and unburdened by the past. The tension that once defined their interactions had softened, not erased, but reshaped by time and circumstance. Before either could say more, the sound of running feet approached. 2 children appeared, Emily's son and daughter, both under 10, both carrying the energy of youth untouched by the weight of adult history. Emily introduced them simply, "This is your grandfather." They stared at him for a beat, then, as children do, accepted the new information as fact. The boy extended a hand with exaggerated formality. The girl gave a shy wave. Richard smiled, truly smiled, and returned the gestures without hesitation. Dinner was simple, roast chicken, vegetables, warm bread, but to Richard, it was a feast. They talked around the table, mostly about ordinary things, school projects, Daniel's latest commission, a recent story Emily had read. The conversation moved gently, without probing. He answered questions when asked, shared stories when appropriate, and allowed the silence to speak when it needed to. By the time dessert was served, the weight in his chest had lessened. He laughed once, genuinely, and the children responded with curiosity. They asked about what he used to do, and he told them carefully about courtrooms and books and how important it was to listen. Emily listened too, quietly, watching the man who had once been unreachable begin, tentatively, to return. As the evening ended and he stood at the door preparing to leave, Emily handed him a small envelope. Inside was a card with a handwritten note. "This is not forgiveness, it's a beginning." He looked at her, eyes misting. "That's all I could ask." The next few weeks unfolded with a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, yet oddly welcome. Richard began visiting Emily's home more often, never uninvited, never unannounced. The invitations came quietly, text messages, brief phone calls, sometimes a handwritten note slipped into the envelope of a mailed postcard from the housing complex. Each gesture carried no expectations, only the quiet suggestion that space had been made for him. And in return, he brought nothing grand, only presence, patience, and the willingness to stay for more than just a few minutes. The children adapted quickly. They asked questions with the candor only children possess, about where he had been, why they hadn't met him sooner, whether he liked dogs or spaghetti or cartoons. Richard answered every question as best he could, often with a smile tinged by something softer than regret. It wasn't just honesty they were after. It was connection. They weren't trying to understand his absence. They were giving him the chance to be part of their present. Sunday dinners became a quiet tradition. At first, they were careful affairs, pleasant, but not yet familiar. Richard offered to help in the kitchen, and though Daniel initially refused, he soon accepted the help with chopping vegetables or stirring sauces. They didn't talk much at first, but the silence between them was no longer strained. It was cooperative, born of shared purpose. Emily watched all of it from a distance, careful not to interrupt what she knew had to grow slowly. Her relationship with Richard was still guarded. They spoke politely, often about practical matters, his health, legal updates, the children's school, but beneath their conversations was a slowly growing thread of trust, one rebuilt from pieces, not from sweeping declarations. One evening, as the children finished a puzzle on the living room floor and Emily cleared the dishes, Richard stood in the doorway, towel in hand, and spoke softly. "I missed so much." She didn't look up immediately. "Yes, you did. I don't expect to make up for that," he said. "But I'd like to be here now." She turned to face him. "Then be here. That's all I ask." He nodded, the simplicity of her response settling deeply into him. No lectures, no guilt, just the present, offered without pretense. As spring deepened, Emily suggested they take a short trip together, a weekend away at a cabin near the Berkshires, something simple, just the five of them. Daniel supported the idea immediately, and the children, thrilled by the idea of hiking and campfires, counted down the days with the excitement only children can summon. Richard was hesitant. The idea of spending 2 nights away from the city, even in a modest cabin, brought out all his insecurities. But he agreed, quietly, without dramatics. He packed lightly, brought the same coat he wore to court, and one paperback novel he hadn't read in years. The cabin was rustic but charming. Tucked near a small lake, surrounded by tall pines and early blooms of wildflowers, it offered a silence unlike the one Richard had known in his sterile apartment. This was not the silence of isolation. It was the sound of space being shared by people who still chose to be near one another. They cooked meals over a fire pit, took long walks along wooded trails, and spent hours playing board games by lantern light. At night, the children fell asleep in sleeping bags near the fireplace, their breathing soft and even. Richard stayed awake long after they had drifted off, watching the embers burn low, listening to the crackle of the wood. Emily joined him one night, a blanket around her shoulders, and sat beside him without a word. He broke the silence. "I never imagined this." She tilted her head. "That we'd sit in a cabin together and roast marshmallows. That I'd be allowed back into your life." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "It was never about allowing you. It was about trusting that you'd choose differently." He nodded, understanding more in her silence than in any long explanation. That weekend, something settled between them. Not resolution, but a truce born from mutual recognition. They both had changed. They both had bent under the weight of years lived separately. And now here in the stillness of the woods, they were rewriting something neither of them had thought could be salvaged. Back in Boston, life resumed, but the change endured. Richard began volunteering at a local senior legal aid clinic. It was a modest operation. A few desks, a coffee machine that barely worked, and stacks of paperwork waiting for review. But he found something in that work he had not felt in years: usefulness without prestige. He helped elderly tenants understand leases, translated dense legal language for the overwhelmed, and offered guidance to those who had no one else to ask. The pace was slower than his previous career, but the gratitude was deeper. Emily visited once, unannounced. She stood in the doorway of the clinic and watched him speak gently to an older woman about a housing claim. His tone was patient, his posture relaxed. He looked up and saw her, offering a faint smile. She nodded in return and left without a word. At home, Daniel began a new painting, a portrait of the children sitting with Richard in the park, their faces lit by afternoon sunlight. He captured the softness in Richard's eyes, the slight lean toward his granddaughter, as she read him a story from a picture book. When he showed it to Emily, she stood in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You captured something I didn't know how to describe." Daniel set down the brush. "Healing isn't loud. Sometimes it looks like this." Later that week, Emily added a new photo to her desk at work. It was a simple image: her father sitting on a bench, flanked by his grandchildren, all three smiling. There was no plaque, no frame, just a photo pinned beside a calendar and a row of sticky notes. It wasn't there to remind her of the past. It was there to remind her what had finally begun. Summer settled over the city, with the kind of warmth that made even the most hurried pedestrians slow their pace. Sidewalk cafes spilled into the streets, children played in neighborhood parks until twilight, and the scent of blooming flowers mixed with distant notes of food trucks lining the squares. For the first time in many years, Richard walked these streets without rushing, without a court date waiting, without a deadline looming like a shadow. He moved more slowly now, not only because of age, but because he had learned the value of what passed him by when he moved too fast. Each morning he rose early, made himself a cup of weak coffee, and sat by the window of his small apartment in the housing complex. He had grown used to its dimensions, its limitations, even its quirks. The radiator knocked loudly at night, the ceiling creaked during rainstorms, but the space had become familiar. It was no longer just shelter. It was a place of his own, earned not by prestige or ownership, but by effort and humility. Twice a week he still volunteered at the legal aid clinic. The office remained humble. Its clients varied, but each face carried the urgency of needing someone who would listen. Richard no longer wore suits to the clinic. A simple button-down shirt and slacks were enough. He brought with him a small briefcase filled with legal pads, a worn pen, and a folder marked Reference. The folder held copies of housing statutes, guidance documents, and handwritten notes. His own, added week after week, adjusted for clarity. It was a quiet form of redemption. Emily visited occasionally, not on a schedule, not out of obligation, but when time allowed and purpose aligned. Sometimes she brought the children, sometimes she came alone, slipping into the clinic during a break from her own courtroom duties. They never announced their relationship there. No one asked. It was understood in the way they greeted one another, in the language that passed between them, with the efficiency of two people who no longer needed to rehearse what mattered. Daniel remained a steady presence at home, his paintings now more intimate than abstract. He had begun a series called Quiet Portraits, small, unpretentious canvases capturing people in everyday moments: a grandfather helping a child tie a shoe, a woman reading a book on the subway, a couple seated in silence but holding hands. The gallery that hosted his work noted that these new pieces sold faster than any he had created before. When asked about them, he simply said, "They're about what endures." Emily's work as a judge had expanded. She was offered a permanent seat on the civil bench and accepted with measured pride. Her chambers changed. The courtroom assigned to her now bore a brass plaque with her name, but her routines remained the same. She still arrived early, she still reviewed every file herself, and she still kept the same photo on her desk, her father sitting beside his grandchildren, the three of them smiling at something just outside the frame. One afternoon, while preparing for a workshop with young law interns, Emily was asked to give a talk on personal integrity in public roles. She hesitated before accepting. It wasn't the topic that troubled her. It was the vulnerability required to speak honestly about what it meant to carry personal history into professional life. When the day arrived, she stood before a group of 20 interns, most of them wide-eyed, eager, notebooks open. She began with cases, policy, precedent, what they expected. But halfway through, she paused. "There is something you need to know," she said, "that no textbook will teach you. You carry every part of your life into this work, every scar, every silence, every conversation you wish you had handled differently. The law will ask you to be neutral, but neutrality doesn't mean emptiness. It means holding space for all you have learned and still choosing fairness." She didn't name her father. She didn't have to. She left them with one last sentence, one that came not from books but from lived truth. "Integrity," she said, "is not perfection. It's remembering who you are, even when no one is watching." That evening, Richard sat on the front steps of the housing complex, a book in his lap, unread. The sun was low, casting gold across the pavement. He was waiting for a ride. Emily had invited him to dinner again, this time to celebrate her new appointment. The children had made decorations from construction paper, and Daniel was preparing a meal with more care than necessary. When the car arrived, Richard stood with some effort, his joints stiff but cooperative. He slid into the passenger seat, greeted the driver, and looked out the window as the city passed by. He recognized streets from earlier parts of his life, corners where he once walked with power, now seen through a lens of simplicity. At the house, he was greeted with warmth. Emily opened the door before he knocked. The children ran to him with the kind of joy that asks no questions. Dinner was noisy, joyful, filled with the clatter of forks and the soft rhythm of shared conversation. At one point, his granddaughter asked if he could help her with a school project about family history. He agreed immediately. After dinner, Daniel brought out a framed copy of the portrait he had finished, the one of Richard with the children in the park. He handed it to him without a word. Richard held it in his lap for a long time, fingers tracing the frame. Later that night, as he prepared to leave, Emily walked him to the door. They stood there for a moment, neither rushing the goodbye. "You've changed," she said. He nodded. "So have you." She took his hand. "It's good to have you here. I'm glad I found my way back," he replied. She watched as he stepped into the night, the taxi pulling away slowly. Inside the house, the children were laughing, Daniel was cleaning up, and the portrait now hung near the bookshelf in the living room. At her desk the next morning, Emily opened her notebook and wrote one sentence before the day began. "Some endings arrive not as conclusions, but as quiet beginnings."